Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And today we're going to talk about the latest on the trade front between the United States and China. And joining us for the discussion is Robert Daly, who is director of the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute on China and the United States, a frequent appearer on the program.
Good to be
Welcome back. Yep. Always good to see you. In the previous times we spoke, whenever I've introduced the notion of trade war,
right,
you've tempered the discussion. I wanted to get an update on that, on the temperature.
Yes, I suppose that I am going to have to change my take on that. I still don't like martial metaphors, but if there's going to be something that's called a trade war at all, which is presumably short of daggers drawn, then I guess this is it, in that this is the most attention we've had to this kind of range of issues with another nation with the most at stake in a very long time. So again, the back of my hand to martial metaphors, but I guess we can call this one a trade war.
I appreciate, actually. Martial metaphors are overused and sometimes they feel creepily inappropriate. The recent arrest of Meng Wanzhou, tell us about that and what its implications are and how it relates to this trade dispute.
Well, the Huawei company is the world's biggest telecom provider, and they are building out a lot of the infrastructure, including what can become the 5G infrastructure in many parts of Asia. In Africa, they are active in Latin America, in Europe, all over the world. World number one, but with a lot of technologies that are still dependent on American components, semiconductors in particular, but not only semiconductors.
Would you say they're China's main competitor for the tech giants of the U.S.?
Yes,
the
they're number one. ZTE, which we talked about before, is sort of the younger brother to Huawei. But it is a national champion company, nominally private, but run by a gentleman who was trained as an engineer in the People's Liberation Army. And so there's long been a suspicion in Washington that they could not be a good player. And so we have banned, for example, government procurement of Huawei components out of fear of there being back doors or other forms of espionage that the Chinese government could carry out through Huawei. Now, to the best of my knowledge, this has never been proven. It's based on our suspicions, which there is indirect proof of, in that we know what the Chinese government's goals are, we know how they've operated under other circumstances. So Huawei has been sort of a toxic name in Congress for years. We've been telling some of our allies, Australia and New Zealand, not to let Huawei into their 5G networks. They've agreed. Canada and the UK have been a little bit more open, but even they are wavering on that. The woman who was just arrested, Meng Wanzhou, is the CFO of Huawei, but also the daughter of the founder. So she's sort of a corporate princeling. She's corporate royalty. So first, how would China receive this? You know, imagine that Sheryl Sandberg, for example, was transiting the Philippines on her way to Japan, and Duterte arrested her at the request of China. Imagine how that would be received here. It would be regarded as hostage taking, whatever the merits of the case might be. That's how it was regarded in China. And that is why China has now taken 2 Canadian hostages. And with the president's statement yesterday that he might be willing to intervene in the case if he gets a good deal in the trade war with China, she's a hostage. So
and the reason it's not a fears of espionage. This is about breaking sanctions with Iran.
So right, this is not about the espionage fears for Huawei, although it's broadly related to the idea that China, through its telecoms and national champions, is not a reliable player. The accusation, which we know some of the details of, but it's really hard to judge it at this stage, is that Ms. Meng lied about Huawei's relationship with a Hong Kong-based company that she had previously been one of the directors of. She lied to American banks and thereby allowed Huawei indirectly to sell machinery that had American components to Iran in violation of sanctions. And therefore, she is now out on bail, but awaiting a decision about whether she will be extradited to the United States.
So your analysis is always very even-handed, and you didn't hesitate to use the word hostages.
Because of, well, the first, initially it was about perceptions within China. This is how this was taken, for the same reason that we would feel this way in the Sheryl Sandberg case. I had expected that there might be an attempt to perhaps walk this back. The administration has said several times that this is a different lane. What the Justice Department does, the pursuit of justice, is a separate lane from the trade war. Well, yes, but these are lanes on the same highway, and the lines between the lanes are dotted for a reason, and it's supposed to be somebody's job to keep the lanes in parallel, right, as the highway moves along. So President Trump did not know about this, although the National Security Advisor did, about the arrest before the meeting with Xi Jinping in Buenos Aires. So it was a separate lane, and that the president wasn't informed, and therefore there was no coordination or consideration of how to regard this in light of the trade war, if we're going to call it that, with China. So the coordination didn't happen then. But since then, again, the president said yesterday, I will intervene if we get a good deal. How else can this possibly be interpreted at that point? And I hope that I'm saying that neutrally. This is not a question of whether I approve or disapprove. It's an issue of words having meanings.
If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck. The arrest of two, or the detainment of two Canadians versus two Americans. Why would China choose to act in that manner?
Well, China has done this before. You may recall that a few years ago, China arrested a couple, Canadian missionaries, who were based in Dandong, which is a city in northeast China, right on the Yalu River, right across the river from North Korea. Mm-hmm. And they ran a coffee shop on the main drag, right on the Yalu, from which, among other things, you can see the bridge that Chinese trains cross to bring goods into North Korea. So people who are interested in whether China's enforcing sanctions or not like to watch that bridge. The couple were both arrested. The woman was let go earlier. These are the Garretts. But Mr. Garrett was detained for about 2 years. And this was because the United States had requested extradition of a Chinese from Canada who had been detained. And so China, it's interesting, has detained Canadians and not Americans, even though this is
Canada keeps getting caught in the middle here.
Canada is rather caught in the middle on this one. Say she's out on bail. Ms. Meng has 2 mansions in Vancouver, so she is not in a prison. I don't think there's any reason to suspect that the Canadians who've been taken into custody are being mistreated in any way, but nor are they free.
What about the talk of extradition to the U.S.? What's the latest on that?
We don't know where that stands. This could be a protracted process even within Canada. Mm-hmm. Certainly if you look at the WeChat Traffic, which is the social media platform that most people in China use, this is being taken as a matter of national pride. The United States has been called a hooligan by the Global Times. And again, this is seen as an attempt to contain China by kidnapping or taking hostage. This is the way it's viewed on mainland China. This woman who's tech royalty. Interestingly, on the WeChat among Chinese in America, it's a somewhat different take, and her story is seen as being more part of the corruption narrative, in that she has a sister, half-sister at Harvard. Her children are educated here. She has numerous mansions. She has numerous passports. So none of this is a comment on the merits of the case. But given that the administration has said that China is our greatest long-term security challenge and that this is a global competition, the question is not initially what are the merits, but why wasn't this coordinated? If we are going to get through this long period of contentious relations with China, we need wisdom more than we need deals. And that's going to require a degree of coordination and careful thought, both about strategy and tactics, which it seems didn't happen in this case.
Beyond this acute circumstance, we had rumblings that China was going to drop the tariffs on U.S. autos from 40% to 15%. We had President Trump reporting all kinds of optimistic things about his sidelines meeting with President Xi at the G20. But then following all of that was massive confusion about what actually was discussed and what the actual deals in place might be.
And some of that has begun to get cleared up a little bit, in that initially the Trump administration had announced auto tariffs. They'd announced purchases of soybeans. They'd announced that there was a 90-day deadline, and there had been no announcement from China. Since then, China has confirmed the 90-day deadline, although they describe it not as a 90-degree deadline by which all issues will be solved, but by which date they will have. I think the exact wording of the announcement they issued was to energetically pursue implementation of the consensus reached in Buenos Aires. A little bit vague. But a lowering of auto tariffs has been announced. That's real. Purchases of soybeans, this is not a new deal. They stopped purchasing soybeans in response to our initial sanctions. So this is maybe the beginning of a return to the status quo ante. Perhaps more purchases of American liquefied natural gas, of Boeing airplanes. China has always been willing to address the narrow gauge issues about the trade deficit by making more short-term purchases. So some of this is real progress. I think that the signs are that by the end of 90 days, President Trump will certainly not be able to declare satisfaction on all the things that America has asked for, especially on the structural changes, support for Chinese state-owned enterprises, for example, intellectual property rights. He will not be satisfied on all of these issues. But there are beginning to be signs that if Trump would like to declare a victory, that he will legitimately be able to say, I've achieved more on these fronts than either of my two predecessors. So it then becomes a political decision for him about what he would like to declare. So progress has already been made of a sort. It is a long way from satisfying all the issues that we're concerned about. Those are going to be worked out most likely over decades, not over months.
So in spite of the so-called hostages, right? In spite of this, you're describing a bit of a thaw.
So far, in its public discourse, in its announcements, in its behavior, the Chinese Communist Party is trying to keep these two areas separate. Is
that possible?
Reason. Yes, because of their control of the media.
Even based on President Trump's suggestion that he tied the two together by saying if he gets a good trade deal, he'll intervene?
They can still keep it separately if they would like to. And so the question is, how concerned are they about their own domestic economic slowdown, which the tariffs are a piece of? They're not the entirety of that. And the answer seems to be they're extremely concerned. And so if they can take these short-term issues off the table, even if it's only for a few months before the tide of difficulties in U.S.-China relations rises again, they will take that. They are facing a number of difficulties on the economic front in China, and this is something that they would like to take off the table for a period if they could. Now, all of this said, it's a roller coaster. The news cycle every day, 3 or 4 times, there are potential reversals. It's a long time till March 1st.
Robert, is there a scenario for a grand bargain of sorts? Or is the preference incrementalism, especially in China's case, where maybe they don't want to talk so much about international or intellectual property rights or state support for industries?
I'm still very, very skeptical about a grand bargain. China can make more purchases. They can make some technical changes to the ways that they treat some foreign companies. They can pass new laws. We don't know how those will be implemented. And they have, for example, taken some what could prove to be concrete moves on intellectual property protection. They have changed the way they speak about the Made in China 2025 initiative, which had been intended to have China dominate key technologies by 2025. They have changed their description of the tactics, and they've toned it down generally. The Chinese,
but have they changed the goals?
No.
Okay.
They haven't changed. Well, they haven't changed their ambitions.
Yes.
And of course, their ambition to be a world technology power is in itself legitimate. It's a question of tactics, and some of the ways that they were approaching that would violate WTO agreements and other best practices. So, of course, for China, as in any negotiation, the question is, what's the least I can possibly do? And part of that will be based on how much they think President Trump wants and needs to declare a victory, which he will have some grounds for doing. If it is true, and there are signs that it is, that President Trump made the agreements he did in Buenos Aires because he doesn't like the volatility in the stock market and because he's concerned about a slowdown in the growth of the American economy in 2019 and the possibilities of a recession in 2020. There are growing signs that the American economy might be slowing down in a timetable that could affect the 2020 elections. If that is part of his thinking, and if it's true that we're headed for a slowdown, it may well be that at the end of the 90 days, the indices of an American slowdown will be stronger, not weaker, than they were in Buenos Aires, in which case he might have a little less leverage, not more. So for China, the play for time is always key.
So the shifting sands of who has hand at any given moment is what you're describing. You know, when you did your speaking tour in China during the election season, and you came back reporting that President Trump was, if not popular, intriguing to the Chinese people.
Yes.
And then you've made the point several times that Trump is not wrong about certain things
Right.
as far as the imbalance and some of the unfairness in the situation. Given all that, what's his standing in China currently, and is it working? Is the Trump style of negotiation with China working?
Well, his standing, of course, is it's very hard to tell, but the Chinese are still deeply interested in Trump, and many are admiring of his brash, self-certain style. They like that. I think what's more important than Trump's standing in China has been Xi Jinping's standing in China. Still very strong. I think that his leadership is on solid ground nationwide, but there are louder and more frequent complaints from more sectors in China, and a sense that he moved too soon with his ambitions, may have overreached a bit with the United States, may have moved too fast on his Belt and Road initiative, which there has been blowback to all over the world. And so there's a rethink about his decision to go from a Deng Xiaoping bide your time view to a much more assertive view within China. Not in a way that threatens his leadership. This has been overplayed, but he faces public opinion problems of his own. They're different than they are in the United States. And then has Trump been effective? We have to see where this goes. I think he is widely given credit in the United States on a bipartisan basis for getting China's attention. Tariffs may well have been the wrong tool, aimed initially at the wrong goal, namely correcting the trade imbalance, but he has China's attention. We now have a dialogue and negotiation with China on a broader range of topics, of important topics, that is being pursued more seriously, with more chance of some incremental progress than we have had for a long time. And here, some credit, yes, must be given.
And we have a deadline of sorts with this 90-day period, so we'll have some results at the end of that.
Unless the president has also said he might extend it. Then he
sure.
said he might
There's always
not.
that possibility.
We'll see.
Okay, well, Robert, thank you very much for joining us, and look forward to the next time we have a chance to talk.
Thank you.